All right, today we're talking about a different kind of conflict, one that's not fought with soldiers and tanks, but with sanctions. Not with bombs, but with boycotts. Yeah, we're diving into the world of economic warfare, where your wallet becomes the weapon.
I mean, think about it. It's a pretty wild question, right? A bomb, well, that's immediate. It's loud. It's visible destruction. But a boycott, that's different. It's this slow, almost invisible pressure that can literally reshape nations, even topple governments, and it affects millions of lives along the way. So, how exactly does this financial pressure get applied? Let's get into it.
Okay, so when we talk about weaponizing the wallet, it really boils down to two main approaches. You've got the top-down strategy, which comes from governments, and then you have the bottom-up approach, which comes from us, the public. But the goal? It's the same, force change by hitting them where it hurts, financially.
So on one hand, you have the heavyweight champion, the state. Governments can unleash these massive things called sanctions. Think of it like they're flipping a switch, trying to cut a whole country off from the global flow of money and goods. And then, on the other side, you've got the power of the people. It's more of a grassroots thing, consumer boycotts. That's where you and I, well, we use our own spending choices to make a statement, to protest. So what does this actually look like in the real world, beyond the theory? Let's check out a couple of really different examples to see just how powerful both of these approaches can be. And here is that bottom-up pressure in action. Just look at this number. In Egypt, consumer boycotts related to the conflict in Palestine apparently led to a massive 70% drop in sales for McDonald's. I mean, wow, that is a huge hit. And it's a perfect example of how thousands of separate individual choices can add up to create a massive financial shockwave. Okay, now let's flip to the top-down approach. Back in 1991, Cuba was importing almost $720 million worth of goods from U.S. subsidiaries. And we're not talking about luxury items here. This was mostly food and medicine, really essential stuff. But then, poof, that lifeline was just severed. All because of a single piece of American law called the Torricelli Act, which was designed to do exactly that, choke off the trade.
And if you're wondering about the intention behind that law, well, there's not much room for interpretation. The guy who sponsored the bill, Robert Torricelli, he said it himself. The whole point was to wreak havoc on that island. Chilling, right? This wasn't about people making choices. This was a calculated government strategy designed to cause as much economic pain as possible.
So that really brings us to the modern sanctions playbook. I mean, how does one country, say the United States, actually project its economic power all the way across the globe? Well, it's not random. There's a very specific playbook they use.
The official term for these things is unilateral course of measures, or UCMs. It sounds complicated, but it's pretty simple. Unilateral means one country is acting on its own, without the UN's blessing. And coercive? Well, that just means they're using their economic muscle to force another country to do what they want.
But wait a second. How does one country make its rules apply to everyone else? The magic trick here is a concept called extraterritoriality. It's a mouthful, I know, but basically it means a country like the US can make its laws reach beyond its own borders. So they can essentially tell a company in, say, Germany or Japan, hey, you can't do business with that country over there because we said so.
And how do they enforce that? Well, this is where the real hammer comes down. Secondary sanctions. Here's how it works. Let's say a bank in France does business with an Iranian company that the U.S. has sanctioned. Well, the U.S. can then turn around and sanction that French bank, which could mean cutting it off from the entire American financial system. It's a huge threat, and it basically forces everyone else in the world to pick a side.
Okay, so you've got this super complex web of rules and massive penalties. And what that creates is this powerful chilling effect. Businesses get so scared of accidentally stepping on a landmine that they start to overreact, and that multiplies the impact of sanctions in ways that were never even intended.
The term for this is overcompliance, and it's exactly what it sounds like. A bank, a shipping company, even a charity, they get so worried about accidentally breaking some obscure rule that they just decide, you know what, we're cutting all ties with that country. Even if the specific thing they're doing is totally legal, it's just not worth the risk.
And you can totally see why they do that, right? This isn't some crazy, irrational fear. The rules are incredibly complicated, and the fines for getting it wrong can be billions of dollars. So for a lot of companies, the safest, most rational business decision is just to stay away. The potential reward is just not worth the massive risk.
So this better safe than sorry attitude, this culture of overcompliance, it doesn't just stay with one company. It snowballs into a global chilling effect. You end up with these invisible walls going up around countries that can absolutely cripple their economies, and the ripple effects spread way beyond the original target.
A perfect and tragic example is Venezuela. Now, the country already had serious problems with government mismanagement, but then you layer on these broad international sanctions, and suddenly investment just dries up. Nobody wants to touch it. And that lack of money for basic maintenance meant the country's entire energy sector, which is vital, just collapsed. And that just threw gasoline on an already raging humanitarian crisis.
And you have to understand, this isn't a one-and-done thing. It's often a long-term strategy of slowly turning up the heat. Just look at the U.S. pressure campaign on China. It didn't happen all at once. It started back in 2018 with some investigations. Then by 2019, they were adding dozens of Chinese tech companies to a blacklist. Fast forward to 2022, and you've got over 600 Chinese companies on that list. Then they added laws that put a huge question mark on any goods coming out of the Xinjiang region. It's a slow, steady escalation that now touches entire supply chains.
But of course, countries on the receiving end of this don't just take it lying down. They adapt. Take Russia. Faced with these huge sanctions from the West, what did they do? They actively pivoted. They started deepening their economic relationships with other major economies that weren't part of the sanctions, places like China, India, and Brazil. They're essentially trying to build a parallel economic system, and that could end up reshaping global trade for years to come.
Which brings us to the biggest and maybe the most important question of all. What's the real price of all this coercion? When all is said and done, who is it that actually pays?
And this is the central dilemma. On one side, you have people who argue that sanctions are a precise, nonviolent tool, a smart alternative to actually going to war. But on the other side, you have critics who say, no, this is just collective punishment that hurts regular people the most. And remember that whole overcompliance thing we talked about? Well, that's where it gets really tough, because even when there are exceptions written into the law for food and medicine, banks are often just too scared to touch the transactions, so the help never gets there.
Which leads to this really stark conclusion. This idea that economic warfare is some kind of clean, bloodless conflict, it's just not true. The quote says it all. The collateral damage is real. We're talking about truncated lives, a total lack of economic growth, and just widespread social distress. It's absolutely not a war without casualties.
And that really leaves us with one last big question to think about. In a normal war, there are supposed to be rules to protect civilians. But when the entire economy becomes the battlefield, when things like access to food, medicine, and jobs become the targets, is there even a line anymore between a soldier and a civilian? When the economy is a battlefield, who are the civilians?